Now, cars retrofitted with fans, smart methods to cheat weight limits, and even suspension systems that help the cars with their on-track handling. Almost every F1 team has tried to stand out from the competition by using different innovative methods. However, according to the F1 rule makers, innovation is only acceptable to some extent. And here are some of the most interesting modifications and designs that were banned forever from the F1 racing scene. Now, in the 2020 season, Mercedes introduced its revolutionary dual-axis steering system for the first time, more commonly called the DAS system. It allowed drivers to pull the steering wheel to adjust the toe of the front wheels and push it back to reset the settings. This design was nothing short of genius because it dramatically improved the warm-up of the front tyres. Initially, the FIA allowed Mercedes to race with DAS because it was legal. Mercedes originally came up with the idea in 2019, and when they took it to the FIA, they said it needed to be modified a little before they would allow it. The original design took the second axis from the lever on the wheel rather than the whole wheel movement. According to the FIA, this was not acceptable, and therefore they needed to move the whole wheel in and out. Mercedes took on the seemingly difficult challenge and introduced the revised version in 2020, which was instantly allowed. Red Bull still protested against it, but the FIA didn't pay much heed. However, in 2021, things took a different turn. The DAS system was an expensive modification, and not every team could adopt it easily. However, since Mercedes did it and won the 2020 championship, it was safe to assume that every team would want it. At the time, the entire world was already dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore testing and developing this technology for every team was just not possible. Therefore, in 2021, the FIA regulations prohibited the use of DAS completely, and this makes Mercedes the only team ever to race with the DAS system and win the championship. In 1970, the Chaparral 2J Sucker Car became the first ever racing vehicle to have fans attached to its rear end. The design aimed to simply achieve one thing: more drag force. The fans drew air from under the chassis and reduced the pressure. The idea was great, and it could even work if executed properly. Because of that, other companies were motivated to try the same. Maurice Phillips' Tyrrell 008 also picked up the same design. However, neither of these cars were able to execute the idea the way it intended to. You see, in the late 1970s, Gordon Murray, the designer from Brabham, decided to use the same seemingly obsolete idea and implement it into his cars for the F1 races. Lotus had already introduced the then brand new concept of ground effect, which made them the champions, and every other team also wanted to understand how it worked. They used Venturi tunnels for ground effect and for Brabham's cars. This just wasn't possible. They used flat 12 Alfa Romeo engines, which were huge, and therefore there wasn't enough space in the car. Ultimately, Murray decided to fit the new cars with fans. The science made sense because the fans would draw air from under the chassis, reduce the pressure, and increase downforce. After a year of designing and modifications, in 1978 he finally introduced the modified BT464 and BT466 at the Swedish Grand Prix. The car was widely welcomed since it was unique, but with the praise, there was also a lot of backlash. Competitors argued that the fan was a moving aerodynamic addition to the car and it violated the F1 rules. Surprisingly enough, Brabham somehow won the argument and they managed to get permission to race with their new BT46 fan cars in the upcoming Grand Prix. Now, when the race day finally came, Brabham's fan cars absolutely shocked everyone. Their speed was insane, and when Niki Lauda took off, everyone was left in awe. Murray's design worked perfectly, and as anticipated, Brabham became the champions. Although the fans loved watching the fan car race, the competitors didn't share the same emotions. Bernie Ecclestone owned Brabham, and since he was also the president of the F1 Constructors Association, he faced a lot of threats. Owners of FOCA teams demanded that the BT46 car be withdrawn from any upcoming races, and if Bernie didn't do it, they would stop supporting him as the president. Commission Sportive Internationale also stepped in and landed the final blow, banning the fan car from ever racing in F1 ever again. Nevertheless, the BT46 popularity, although short-lived, left an everlasting impact on F1. It became one of the few examples of cars that were just too good to race in F1. Now, in the late 1990s, McLaren came up with a unique idea of adding an extra brake pedal to their MP412. This additional pedal controlled the rear wheel brakes only, helping the drivers to turn into corners easily and without the fear of losing traction. But this was not the only reason. McLaren's primary focus was to dial down understeer. When driving at extremely high speeds, the cars continue to go straight ahead even if the drivers steer into a corner. This leads to a high chance of drivers losing control of the car and crashing. However, McLaren's brake steer system was designed specifically to counteract this. According to McLaren, the double pedal brake design cut half a second per lap in initial testing and in F1 races. Half a second matters a lot. The drivers also liked the new design, and therefore McLaren decided to take it into the races. Now, in the beginning, McLaren kept the system a closely guarded secret. They didn't want the rival teams to copy their designs and take the competitive edge over them. However, this secret didn't remain a secret for long. During the 1998 season, a photographer noticed that the rear brake disc on McLaren cars would glow around the corners. Drivers almost never applied brakes around this area, and this made the glowing disc suspicious. Soon afterward, the secret was out, and the other teams protested against the brake steer system. Ultimately, McLaren was forced to retire this system and continue the races with conventional braking systems. But regardless of the ban, McLaren managed to secure the 1998 championship with a normal car. In the early 1980s, Lotus became the innovator of the revolutionary computer-controlled hydraulic suspension system, commonly known as active suspension, which automatically adjusts the suspension settings with regard to the changing road surface. Back then, this was an insane innovation because nobody had ever done it before. However, it wasn't Lotus that became known for it in the longer run. Although they were the ones who kicked things off with the active suspension system, Williams applied the same and had a lot of success with it with their cars. They won the 1992 and 1993 championships with their FW14B and FW15C cars using the active suspension systems. The systems made their cars alive, and according to some drivers, it made the cars easier to drive. The drivers also raised concerns because they couldn't predict how the car would behave on track at such high speeds, but nonetheless, the suspension system worked wonders, and drivers easily relied on it. But just like McLaren did with their brake steer system, Williams' use of active suspension became the victim of controversy and protests. Competitors' teams argued that since it made the cars much easier to drive, it took out the competition from the race.
And the dominance, the superiority of the Williams here in Kyalami is quite incredible. Because even though Senna is in, as James has said, last year's car, so for that matter are Nigel Mansell and Riccardo Patrese, with the notable exception of the fact that they have the new active suspension, which has no conventional metal springs. Instead it has high pressure hydraulics, and it really works here at Kyalami.
Moreover, the advanced system was extremely expensive, and teams with limited budgets couldn't afford to use them in their cars. All in all, the argument was that this active suspension system made the races unfair by giving Williams an unfair advantage of sorts. Ultimately, at the end of the 1993 season, F1 decided to ban active suspension and many other electronic driver aids. To date, active suspension systems remain prohibited in F1 only because they're too good for the races. McLaren's f-duct was an innovative aerodynamic design that was first introduced in 2010 on the MP425 car. The duct helped reduce drag on the rear wing of the car in long straights, resulting in higher top speeds. While it was an amazing design, it didn't settle well with rival teams in the paddock. They started to copy the design and make their own versions. And by mid-2010, every team, including Ferrari and Mercedes, had jumped on the bandwagon. However, none of them could make it as seamless as McLaren did. Initially, the f-duct didn't raise any issues. However, one of the first controversies that popped up was that the f-duct was an extremely dangerous design addition. Drivers had to use their hands or knees to open the duct manually, which raised safety concerns.
We're on board with Fernando Alonso. Look, his left hand is covering a hole in the side of the cockpit. His right hand, he's looking down now, adjusting the brake balance.
Taking away the focus from the track at such high speeds to open or close the duct could result in terrible accidents, and therefore the system needs to be regulated. Along with that, the f-duct system was costly. Teams like McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes could spare the funds for developing this system and integrating them in their cars, but the smaller teams just didn't have the capital. Therefore, a disparity was created in the grid and made the races unfair because the richer teams could have faster cars while the poorer teams lagged behind. But perhaps the biggest point of argument was that the f-duct violated the rule of prohibited movable aerodynamic parts and devices on cars. In essence, the f-duct was an aerodynamic device that helped achieve higher speeds, and therefore it was illegal. Surprisingly though, this reason didn't result in the eventual ban of the f-duct. Now, throughout the 2010 season, McLaren benefited greatly, winning 5 races and securing the second place in the Constructors' Championship. At the end of the season, the FIA banned it, citing safety concerns and hefty costs as the reasons. From 2006 to 2008, Honda Racing participated in the F1 races but couldn't manage a win in any of the races. Given the disappointing results and the global financial crisis of 2008, Honda had to withdraw completely from F1. The team had no funding, the engine supplier was out, and its future was in shambles. Over 700 employees were on the verge of losing their jobs, and the biggest risk was that their factory in Brackley, England would also shut down. Thankfully, Team Honda had already developed their car for the 2009 season in line with the new aerodynamic regulations. In early 2009, after Brawn led a management buyout of the Honda team, it was renamed Brawn GP. Funding of the team was scraped from various sources, including sponsorship deals. Designed under Brawn's leadership, the car had a unique and innovative double diffuser design that was hoped to be a game changer for Honda. Now, the design introduced several strategically placed holes in the car's floor. This area usually remained solid. However, Honda's aerodynamic team mixed things up to aid the aerodynamics of their car. Located at the junction between the reference plane, which is the lowest structural element, and the step plane, which is just 50mm higher and extends 250mm on either side of the car, these holes were going to change everything for the team. In 2009, they dominated the entire season and clinched both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. However, issues started to arise after that. The rules demanded that the transitional area should be kept solid and impenetrable. The innovative interpretation did allow the segmented transitions with gaps to direct airflow, and both Williams and Toyota also interpreted this idea. However, in 2011, double diffusers were ultimately banned from F1 forever. Now, in 1982, Lotus, Williams and Brabham struggled to keep up with the turbocharged cars dominating the season at the front of the grid. They knew they had to devise some sort of clever scheme to make their cars faster, and that meant only one thing: running their cars below the minimum weight limit. Finally, the three teams did something that could be argued was borderline cheating. They emptied their reserve water tanks, which were used to cool the brakes before the race, and refilled them after the race ended. This ultimately helped them avoid the post-race inspection of cars and win races. Now, one of the most commonly cited examples is of Nelson Piquet, who used his strategy to win his home race. Keke Rosberg also did the same and came in second position. However, after their clever tactic was revealed to the world, both drivers were disqualified. At the time, it was argued that using this tactic was legal, and looking at it from a technical standpoint, it might have been legal. Nonetheless, the FIA banned it completely. 2 years later, Tyrrell decided to test their luck with the same tactic, but with a slight twist. They drained the water tanks before the race, and when the race ended, they refilled the tanks with 2 extra gallons of water and 140 pounds of lead shot. The stewards realised this cheating practice, and ultimately Tyrrell was disqualified from the entire 1984 championship. Although many argue that this was just a technicality and it was legal, it was widely considered cheating because they were gaining an unfair advantage by violating a straightforward rule of minimum weight. The Lotus 88 was one of Colin Chapman's most crazy inventions because the car had 2 chassis, one inside the other, like Tupperware. The twin chassis design was Lotus's attempt to harness ground effect. In 1981, they introduced it, and at the time, the rule makers were already working against ground effect. The siding skirts were already banned, and a mandatory gap between the bottom of the car and the track was also pushed. Therefore, the underbody seal required for the ground effect was made impossible. To overcome this, Chapman created a secondary outer chassis on which he mounted the entire bodywork. The inner chassis acted as the main structure of the car, while the outer chassis could move independently. Aerodynamic forces pushed the outer chassis down, achieving the underbody seal that was required for the ground effect. The design was insane, and everyone knew that this would work wonderfully. Therefore, like with every innovation, the rival team started to protest against the Lotus 88. Because of this, the Lotus 88 never raced, and in 1983 the ground effect cars were banned permanently, making the Lotus 88 a crazy invention that nobody got to see in action. Today, F1 just doesn't have the same competitive feel as it did in the 1980s and 90s. Teams went above and beyond to add devices and modifications to their cars to make them faster and easier to drive. Unfortunately, because almost every innovation has either been outrightly banned or protested against for various reasons, F1 racing has become boring and predictable.